one, we learned about the Old Testament and how it was formed. And then on the second week, we learned about some books that were written between the Testaments. Today we're going to learn about one of these books in particular, and it's the book of Tobit in the Catholic New American Bible. So providing our lesson today are Joan and Leo Heiting. They are self-proclaimed cradle Catholics who received their initial religious formation in the elementary schools and at the hands of some very generous and dedicated nuns, with which several of us in this class can relate to. They met as freshmen at Marquette University, operated by the Jesuits in Milwaukee. Joan was enrolled in the elementary education program while Leo attended the engineering school. They married at the end of their sophomore years, and Joan accepted a teaching job at an elementary school while continuing her degree at Marquette via the medium of evening and summer school classes. After remaining for her senior year, Leo accepted employment with Texas Instruments in 1961, so they came down here to Texas. As Leo began what was to become a 37-year career with TI, Joan taught at a Catholic elementary school in Dallas. This, however, was interrupted when the first of their 3 adopted children came along. Joan then began 13 years service as a stay-at-home mom. But then she returned to the field of education as a teacher and later principal in the Plano public school system. During this time, she served as founding principal of 2 elementary schools and 1 middle school. They live in Richardson and are longtime parishioners at St. Mark the Evangelist Church in Plano, where they have enjoyed many opportunities for service, and in particular, 15-year period of teaching Old Testament to 6th graders of their parish. What a challenge. They completed a 4-year program of Bible study offered by the University of Dallas and have generously accepted our invitation to speak to us today on the book of Tobit as we continue our discussion on the books between the Testaments. Please make welcome Joan and Leo.
We are delighted to be here. I'm a little bit intimidated because your speaker last week was a theologian, and we are certainly not that. We're just ordinary people who have a great interest in the Bible that came to us a little bit late in life because as cradle Catholics, many homes didn't even have Bibles in their home, and if we did, they were used to record weddings and ceremonies and deaths, and so our experience was minimal. In Catholic grade school, we had Bible stories of some of the famous Old Testament figures, and that was about the extent of it. So our knowledge has come more recently. Yes?
What is a cradle Catholic?
Good question. Someone who was born Catholic and became one because they were, and that was part of our life, yes. I guess we're used to throwing that term around in our church. So.
We call Methodists like it. We're like it.
Okay. Thank you for having us today. We were very impressed with the presentation we saw on the video that Scott did last week. He was very fair and comprehensive and certainly knows much more about the history of the canons of the church than we do. But I did want to make just a couple of additional comments about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the canon and then introduce the book of Tobit. Leo's going to tell you the story of Tobit because I know it's not in your Bibles and most of you probably have not read it. And then we're going to talk about what the message in Tobit really is. So first of all, on the canon, Father Larry Boat, who is a Paulist priest and very renowned biblical scholar, is deceased, but he wrote this book called Understanding the Old Testament. And he tells us that the big question is the Hebrew Bible or the Septuagint Bible the most genuine Bible? And I think Scott told us many pluses and negatives of both. So it's a matter of the way our traditions have gone. In the Catholic tradition, we've gone with the Septuagint Bible because it is the one that the early Christians, most of them, used, especially after they moved. Some of the Hebrew people had moved to other countries, particularly Alexandria, Egypt. And one of the stories that Father Larry tells is there is a legend that the Jewish colony living in Alexandria was wanting a Greek-written Bible. And King Ptolemy got together 70 or 72, depending on what version you look at, scholars, and put them in separate chambers and asked them each to translate the Hebrew Bible into the Greek. And supposedly when he gathered them back together, they had all written about literally almost identical texts. Now, that's a legend, and so we take it for what it's worth. We do know that around the 1st century, Jewish rabbis and leaders got together and they took the books of the Hebrew Bible and formulated them as their canon. And it took a little bit longer before our church fathers, such as Jerome, looked at the Septuagint Bible for the same purpose. And when they did that, they included 7 of the Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical books into the Bible, which is the Septuagint. And that was never formally accepted in the church, but it was commonly used up until the Council of Trent and the Reformation, when the Catholic Church said, Catholic Christians said, this is the Bible that we are using because it goes back to before Christ. And there's really not anything in writing that says why they came to that decision, but it was the wisdom of a number of people. And that was the point at which other Christian faiths moved back to the Hebrew Bible, because it was the earliest Bible. So that's why we are where we are. So we continue to use it because it's part of our tradition. We look at the Deuterocanonical books because they give us another piece of the story and help us see Jewish life and Christian life in another way. And particularly the book of Tobit, which is such a beautiful book. We even in the Catholic Church use some readings from Tobit to celebrate marriages, and we use them to celebrate holy days in which we honor angels, because both of those are an important part of the Tobit story. So as to the book of Tobit itself, we do know certain things. We know that the author was not a historian, because he scrambles time, facts, and geography in his book. He didn't write this book to be a record of history. He wrote it rather to tell a story about what Jewish family life was like for the Jews who were in diaspora, who had moved out of Israel and were living in other parts of the land, and who didn't have the close connections to their faith that they had when they were living in Israel. And so he's trying to bring out for the people reading it that this is the way a Jewish family is expected to live, what Jewish family life should look like, what it should consist of. Basically, there are 2 main aspects to Jewish family life that come in this story. One is about prayer, and one is about virtuous acts or good works for other people. We don't know who that author was. We do believe it was a single person from the way he has written the book and from what has been studied. Fragments of the book were found at the Qumran, and they were written in Hebrew and Aramaic, not in Greek, so we think they are fairly valid to study. So the story begins with Tobit declaring himself. And he says, I, Tobit, have walked all the days of my life on paths of truth and righteousness for my kinsmen and my people who have been deported with me to Nineveh in Assyria. Because he is talking now to people who have left Jerusalem and Israel and who are in the diaspora. And with that, we're going to ask Leo to come up and tell us the story. Leo had, I should say this, one of us has a hip problem, and it's not me.
Well, I need to start by telling you of my introduction to the state of Texas. I was here for a couple months back in the early 50s for basic training at Lackland Air Force Base. I shouldn't even tell you how long ago that was. But the next visit was an in-plant interview trip to TI. And I got on an airplane in Chicago that afternoon, an April afternoon. It was probably in the low 30s, and it was misty, a typical yucky Midwestern April afternoon. And we landed here about 7 o'clock at night, and it was 70 degrees, and when it got dark, the stars were out, and I thought, this is the place. If I had made that trip in August, we would have gone to work right beyond.
What he isn't telling you is he came back and he said, I don't care how much money TI gives us, we're going to Texas.
And they didn't give me enough. As we get into the book of Tobit, the author is going to be recounting some events that took place roughly in the 8th century before Christ, about 750 BC. And before we get into that, I want to go back a couple of centuries earlier than that and kind of paint a scenario into which Tobit found himself as he shows up in the book. So now we're talking about the time when Solomon was still the king. And Solomon had built the first temple in Jerusalem, and the temple became the place of worship for the 12 tribes of Israel. So when they would have celebrations, particular celebrations like the Feast of Booths, that would take place in the temple in Jerusalem. And people would come from throughout the kingdom to participate in that worship. And that's the way things were through the remainder of the reign of Solomon. But when he passed away, there was a real upheaval in the situation in Israel. Up to the time of his death, it had been a single unified kingdom. And right after his death, that changed, and they suddenly became two separate kingdoms. The northern kingdom was focused around Samaria, and thereafter it was referred to as Israel. And the southern kingdom included the city of Jerusalem, and it was referred to as Judah. And so, if we fast forward now to 750 BC, and Tobit shows up in the book. He's living with his parents and with his siblings, and he's living in the northern kingdom. And this is a long time after the schism between the two kingdoms. And the people from the northern kingdom, who during the reign of Solomon had gone to Jerusalem to worship, no longer did so. If they were going to have a celebration of a festival or something, it took place within the confines of their own territory. But Tobit came along, and he was a young man, but he was different. He still was pretty tradition-bound, and he continued the practice of periodically each year traveling to Jerusalem to worship there. And when he did so, he would take enough money along so that he could tithe, and he could properly provide his support to the operation of the temple, just as we do today. We support our churches and are financially to keep them going. But he made a step further. When he would leave Jerusalem on his way back to where he lived, he would leave enough money that was there for the support of widows and orphans. And he did that because he strongly believed in almsgiving. That was an important part of his Judaism. And when he got to the age of marriageable age, he found a Jewish woman. Her name was Anna. And they fell in love, and they married. And that, too, was staying in tune with his Jewish traditions. That it was right for Jewish people to marry Jewish people and keep it within the same faith tradition. And they had a son who they named Tobiah. So for a number of years then, the small family lived in the northern kingdom of Israel. But that came to an end in 721 or 722 BC, when the Assyrian kingdom, under their king Shalmaneser, who probably wasn't really the king at the time, but in the story he is, they overcame the northern kingdom, and they deported all of the citizens to Nineveh. And Tobit and Anna and Tobiah were included in that deportation. When they got to Nineveh, they immediately ran into a problem because they found that it was very difficult to find foods that were appropriate for Jewish consumption. And so many of them immediately turned to their practice of eating the same kind of foods as the Ninevites, even though a lot of those foods were considered to be unclean according to Jewish standards. And while during his early stay in Nineveh, Tobit adopted a new practice, and that stemmed from his belief that when a Jewish person dies, they are entitled to a proper Jewish burial. And the Ninevites would not provide that to the Jewish people. When one died, they simply took the body and left it outside the gates of the city and left it there to waste away. So Tobit began the practice of providing a burial to his Jewish friends and neighbors as they passed away. And so it's interesting to watch what the author is doing here, and all the things that he's telling us about Tobit. He's trying to characterize him as the ultimate Jewish man. He's the iconic model. And I think we use that word too much sometimes today, but I think it's an appropriate description of him. He was the model for the rest of the people to follow, because he wanted to know what his God expected of him, and he did his very best to meet those expectations. And it turned out that while he was in Nineveh, he became a fairly successful businessman too, as the king Sennacherib, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself, the king Shalmaneser needed to have a lot of things, goods, products, to maintain his kingdom, and much of that he acquired from an adjacent territory which was called Media. And Tobit became a friend of the king, and the king eventually appointed him as his purchasing agent. So Tobit's job was to travel periodically to Media and to identify the things that the king was going to need and to procure them for him and get them back to Nineveh in a timely fashion. And apparently he did a pretty good job of that, because over the years he was able to amass a substantial fortune that would be useful to him and his family in the future. And on one of his trips to Nineveh, it was a business trip, to Media, he made a side trip to a town called Rages, and there he had a kinsman whose name was Gabael, and he had taken along the major portion of his financial assets because he wanted to leave them with Gabael in his care. He thought it would be safer there with Gabael in Media than it would be back in Nineveh. And so that's what he did. And for the remainder of the reign of the king, Tobit and his family had things pretty good. Life was good for them. But with the death of the king, things turned against him. The first thing that happened was he found that the roads to Media had become very dangerous, and he wasn't going to be able to travel there anymore. And that bothered him because most of his assets were in Media, and he might never be able to go and recover them. But he was far more troubled by the behavior of the next king, a man named Sennacherib. And Sennacherib was not very favorable to the Jews, and in fact he was murdering some of them. And he passed a law that said there's going to be no more Jewish burial going on around here. He wouldn't even leave the Jewish people bury their dead. But Tobit continued his practice of providing proper Jewish burials for the people surreptitiously, but he finally got the realization that Sennacherib probably knew what he was doing, and his life was in danger. And so he had to leave Anna and Tobiah and flee into hiding somewhere. And when Sennacherib found out that he did it, he simply confiscated all the financial assets that Tobit had left in Nineveh. And so Anna became destitute, and she had to establish a business. And she began weaving materials into cloth, which she could sell to the people around her, and that's the way she supported herself and Tobiah. And during all this time, during the remainder of the reign of Sennacherib, Tobit had to remain in hiding. But when the king was finally assassinated, then he was able to come back to his family. And when he came back, Anna continued to be the breadwinner for the family, and he returned to his practice of providing burials for the Jewish people. Well, the people around him, his friends and relatives, had seen him do this for quite some time, and they were getting tired of it. And they started criticizing him and saying, why do you continue to do this? Every time you do it, you get yourself and your family in trouble, and it's just dumb. Why don't you stop? Well, he was just horrified by the criticism that he was receiving, because he believed that he was doing what his God wanted him to do, and he was being criticized for it. And one night, he went to bed, and he was so troubled he just couldn't go to sleep. So he went outdoors, and he lay down on the lawn, and he fell asleep there. And with that, some birds came over, and their droppings fell in his eyes. He developed cataracts, and he was blinded. And it was about that same time when Anna had completed the job of making some cloth and had delivered it to the customer, and he had paid her the amount of money that they had agreed upon. But he took pity on her and gave her a goat, which she could take home to her family, I suppose, to provide them with milk. But when she told Tobit this story, he was angry with her because he thought she had accepted more than the amount of money that they had agreed to for the job. She had accepted this goat as well, and he thought that was unfair. Well, Anna didn't react very well to his attitude, and she said to him, "Where are your charitable deeds now? Where are your virtuous acts? See, your true character is finally showing itself." Well, Tobit really felt horrible. He was penniless, he was blind, and the people nearest and dearest to him were criticizing him. So he prayed to God, and he prayed that he would be allowed to die, and he'd be freed from his misery. Well, it turned out at the same time in Plano, which is a city in Media, Tobit had another relative. His name was Raguel. And Raguel had a daughter. Her name was Sarah. Sarah was a beautiful young woman. She had a delightful demeanor. Everybody around her really liked her. But just as Tobit had, she had suffered a terrible reversal in her life. She had married a young Jewish man, and the night of their wedding, as they were going to bed together, a demon, Asmodeus, showed up and killed her husband. And she subsequently married 6 other young men, and in each case, the night of the wedding, Asmodeus would show up and kill the husband. So she was just terribly depressed. And she actually was at the point of committing suicide. But she didn't do it because she knew how badly that would hurt her father. So instead, she too prayed to God that she be allowed to die and freed from her misery. Well, their prayers were heard in heaven, but they weren't going to be responded to. They weren't going to get the deaths that they had prayed for, because God called one of his angels to him. The angel's name was Raphael, and God told Raphael to go to earth. And he had 2 tasks to perform there. One, he was to arrange it so that Tobit would be restored. And the other thing, he was to arrange it so that Tobiah and Sarah could marry, and that Tobit would be freed, saved from the ravages of Asmodeus. So, where am I in the story here? At that time now, Tobit didn't know anything about this plan that was being hatched in heaven. And all he knew was that he had prayed that he be allowed to die, and he thought that was going to happen. So he called Tobiah to him one day to give him some instructions for the future. And he told him that he felt that he was dying. And when he died, he hoped that Tobiah would provide him with a proper Jewish burial, and that he would then take care of his mother for the rest of her life so she might live it out in peace. And he gave us some instructions for the proper behavior of a young Jewish man. And in those instructions, he highlighted the importance of almsgiving. Throughout his life, almsgiving was a big thing for him. And he told Tobiah that when the time came for him to marry, he should marry a Jewish woman and keep the marriage within the Jewish faith. And then finally, he revealed to Tobiah the fact that he had left a substantial sum of money with his kinsman in Media, and explained that when I die, you are my heir, and that money will belong to you. So he urged Tobiah to go to Media to recover that money from Gabael. But Tobiah responded that I've never been to Media, I have no idea how to get there, and I'll probably get lost. And even if I get there, I don't know how I'm going to convince Gabael that I am indeed your son. So Tobit said to him, well, I'd like you to go into the city and find somebody who's familiar with Media and can take you there. So Tobiah did that, and the first person he encountered in the city was Raphael. And Raphael did not come as an angel. He took on the persona of another Jewish young man, perhaps even a relative of Tobiah's. And he explained to Tobiah that he was very familiar with Media. He had been there many times, and he'd be happy to take him there. So the two young men set off on their travel to Media, and it was a multi-day trip. But the evening of the first day, they simply stopped along the side of the road and slept there. And in the morning, when he got up, Tobiah went down to a nearby lake. He jumped in to refresh himself, and with that, a huge fish jumped up and fell back into the water right at his feet. And it started to try and bite one of his feet. But Raphael saw what was going on, and he called to Tobiah and said, don't let the fish get away. Bring it to me. And so Tobiah did that, and the angel told him to remove the gall and the heart and the liver of the fish, and explain that the heart and the liver, when it's burned, will give off an offensive odor, and it can be used to drive off any demon that might be in the area. And he explained that the gall can be used to remove the cataracts from a blind person and restore their sight. And so they continued then the next day on their way into Media. And Raphael is taking Tobiah to the city of Ecbatana, which is where Raguel and his daughter Sarah are living. And he explains that you, Tobiah, are the closest remaining relative of Sarah, and you're entitled to marry her and get a dowry from her father. So they arrive at Raguel's house, and Tobiah introduces himself as the son of Tobit. And when I was given this to me myself the other day, I said Tobiah introduced himself as the son of Tobit. That's not going to work. But when he found that when Raguel found that he was the son of Tobit, he just welcomed him really warmly. He was just happy that Tobiah was there to visit him. And he then introduced Tobiah to his daughter, to Sarah. And Tobiah immediately fell in love with Sarah. And he asked Raguel if he could have his daughter in marriage. And Raguel was thrilled because possibly his daughter finally was going to have a family. He certainly agreed to it. So the marriage went forward, and it took place. And that night, as the party went back to the bridal chamber, Tobiah took with him the heart and the liver of the fish, and he put it on some embers and started it burning, and that drove away Asmodeus, and he was never to return. So Tobiah was free of the curse of Asmodeus. The next day then began a 2-week period of celebration of the marriage that took place in the home of Raguel. And at the beginning of that 2 weeks, Tobiah asked Raphael to go alone by himself to Media and out into the far eastern extremity of Media and meet with Gabael and retrieve the money and bring it back to him, Tobiah. So that's what happened, and they got to the end of the 2 weeks, and Tobiah asked Raguel if he might have leave to go back to visit with his parents, and he wanted to take his wife with him to introduce her. And Raguel first tried to convince him to stay in Ecbatana. That would be a great place for them all to live. But Tobiah explained that he had been away from his parents for a long time. They had no idea whether he was still alive or not, and he really needed to go back. So Raguel gave him his good wishes, and they headed off for Nineveh. And when they were about a day's travel from the home of Tobit and Anna, the angel suggested to Tobiah that the two of them go ahead at a faster pace and let the remainder of the group come at their leisurely pace. And so they did that. And when they arrived at the home of Tobit and Anna, Tobiah immediately went to his father and applied the gall to his eyes. And the cataracts dropped off, and Tobit's sight was restored. And then at that point, Tobiah revealed to his mother and father that he had married one of their kinswomen, Sarah. And he explained that she was on the way and would be arriving pretty shortly. And so with that, Tobit went down to the city gates and waited there for her. And when she arrived, he embraced her just as warmly as Raguel had embraced Tobiah when they first met. And it's at this point in the story when the angel reveals to Tobit and Tobiah who he really is, that he is in fact one of God's 7 angels. And it was he who had been sent to earth to challenge Tobit with his blinding. And it was he who carried the message in the prayers of Tobit and Anna to God. And it was he who had been sent to the earth to heal Tobit and Anna. And that's basically the end of the story. Chapter 13 in the book consists exclusively of Tobit's prayer of thanksgiving to God for all the blessings that have come to him. And that is a beautiful prayer. If you can get a copy of it, it's really worth reading. And then the final chapter of the book, chapter 14, Tobit is truly where he's approaching his death. And he's trying to convince Tobiah that after he, Tobit, and Anna have died, Tobiah should move his family to the eastern Media, because Nineveh is going to be destroyed. And that's the end of the story. So I think Joan has some thoughts about it.
Why don't you stay there?
I'm sorry?
Why don't you stay there?
Okay.
One of the things that strikes me about this story, and that maybe puts it on our own individual level, is Tobit was willing to die rather than not do the good deeds that he did. And as we think about our faith, our Methodist faith or our Catholic faith, a good question to ponder when you leave today or to take away is, what practices within our faith, your faith, are you willing to go to the wall for? How much do we as modern day Christians give up because we think that we need to be kind to someone for some other reason, or we just aren't willing to stand up? I heard a preacher on the radio as we were coming up today. How often do you go out to a stranger and do you say, I'd like you to come to our church? I think you people do a much better job of that than we do as Catholics. But then in thinking about the more important aspects of your faith as well as just meeting others. But what do we do? What things do we really say we will stand up for, even if it means that in some way we'll be punished? We're having a little personal crisis in our family with one of our sons who doesn't understand one of the acts of charity that we're doing, and has really disturbed that we are doing it. And we can't convince him of the justice of it, nor can he convince us, but it may mean our family isn't quite on center right now, and where do we draw that line? And we believe that this is what the Lord wants us to do. So I think we all maybe at some point come up with that. You heard many examples of prayer the book of Tobit really has several prayers because it's not just the two death prayers, but there's a prayer before the wedding feast that Tobiah and Sarah prayed together too, as well as the closing prayer. So prayer is very significant within this book. But there is a central primary religious message in the book. And that message is that we all have difficulties in life. And in the midst of those difficulties, even when we wonder whether God is there with us, when Leo and I wonder, are we doing really what God wants us to do in the situation we're in right now? He is there, and He will be there for us if we remain faithful to Him. And so that is the most significant point that comes out of this book to be true. Certainly, the book was written so that we would see the Jewish family as living a good Jewish life, and we in our lives want to live the lives that our religions pass to us. It also affirms the importance of community. Even at the very end, where Tobit says to Tobiah, you take your family and you go back and live with your wife's community. They're concerned about one another throughout. A phrase that I like that came out of one of the prayers is Tobit moves from despair to prayer. And he does that, as hopefully we do. One of the parts of his final prayer is this: when you turn back to Him with all your heart to do what is right before Him, then He will turn back to you and no longer hide His face from you. We don't always see Him where He is. We see Him where we think He is and where we want Him to be, but we don't always see Him where He is. So that's our story. We have a couple of handouts that will recap and elaborate on some of those that I'll put out if you would like to take them with you. Put them on the front chairs, I think. And we so appreciate your having us. Questions? Yes?
Yeah, one of the things that always enthralls me about this story is that how important it was to early Christians. A lot of the apostolic fathers, including Origen, said that new converts should be required to read Tobit first before they even got to the gospel. Tobit, Judith, and Esther, before they were even, to get into the gospel, was kind of preparatory stuff. So it's very important to the early Christians.
Thank you for sharing that, because I had not heard that comment. We took our 4-year Bible study, and it was concentrated strictly on the books of the Bible as a follow-up. Oh, you have? Okay.
I'll give you the quote.
Okay. But there's a follow-up course at the University of Dallas on the fathers of the church, and Origen and Jerome and the others. And that's a course we've thought about taking but haven't done it yet. Good comment. Anything else? Yes?
The thought of preparation, to me, that is such a great point, because as an early Christian, you're 22 or 23 years old and you're starting your journey, this concept of giving your life for your faith, that's a difficult concept for someone that young.
Yes.
It's difficult concept for anyone, and we have nothing that really prepares us for what that means. But I think God, along the way in my journey, does things and provides me with things that lets me come to that decision. And I believe that's marriage, and I believe that's children, and I believe that's grandchildren. I first understood the concept of giving my life for someone when I married Joan. I still struggled with it. I mean, this concept was new to me when we got married. Then we had our children, our son and our daughter, and I go, whoa, would I die for these two? Well, yeah, I would. But then along came my grandchildren here, and so I experienced from my heart, without a doubt, I would die for them. And so if I feel that strongly about my grandchildren, I feel that strongly about my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So the way I feel about that agape love today is so different than what I felt 40 years ago.
That's part of our growth as Christians. I think.
Absolutely.
It's part of our growth as Christians. The other thing that it does for us is, you know, I look back at a time in our life when one of our teenagers was really being difficult, and I couldn't understand why we were being subjected to that. But then as I went back into education and I became a principal, I realized what had happened to me in that experience enabled me later to help others who came to me because in their role as parents too, so that's.
Let me just mention, one of the encyclicals that the current Pope wrote was Deus Caritas Est, God is love. And I don't mean to proselytize anybody, but it's the only encyclical I've ever been able to read and understand. But it is a great one. It's worth reading if you can get a copy of it.
So thank you very much. It's been a
I just have-